Over the years is it's better when you don't mess with certain holidays. And I'll share an experience that I had a number of years ago. It's while Rebecca and I were still dating, and I went over to her family for Thanksgiving dinner. And let me just preface this entire story by saying that Rebecca's mom is a phenomenal cook. She is great at baking, she is great at cooking, but on this one particular Thanksgiving weekend, she decided to switch things up. And on Thanksgiving, there are certain foods that I kind of expect to be there, a turkey, mashed potatoes, vegetables with cheese sauce, and some of those staples weren't there. She went a little bit more Martha Stewart on us that weekend, and there was vegetables, I didn't really know what they were. There wasn't any mashed potatoes, there was some grainy things, and I kind of went away. It was a great meal, but I'm like, that wasn't what Thanksgiving was all about. Thankfully, we haven't gone back to that. I think I voiced my complaint loudly enough. Well, you can't be honest in family? What? So the good news is the meal changed. The even better news is I'm still at the meal. But I realize in saying that, I'm going to probably mess up Thanksgiving slightly a little bit here this morning because you probably, if you picked up on it, the passage we read this morning is from the book of Leviticus. And it's one of those books that is often easily skipped over, perhaps ignored, perhaps sometimes wondered, why is it even in the Bible? If anyone has ever started kind of a read the Bible through from Genesis to Revelation, you start in Genesis and things are going really well, and you hit your stride at about Exodus, and then suddenly, wham, there's Leviticus. It's like a roadblock. And you start to think, what is up with Leviticus? I mean, you start to read through it, and you notice that there is often detailed and even gruesome examples of animal sacrifice. You can read through Leviticus and see that there are oftentimes mind-numbing instructions over skin disease and how to deal with mildew. There's a mismatch of kind of random comments about, not mixing seeds or not wearing certain fibers of clothes together. And then there's the blatantly obvious things that you wonder, why was that even included? Like, for example, God says, you know what? It's not cool to have sex with your sister or with animals. And you think, do we really need to be told that? And so as you look at the book of Leviticus, you start to wonder, what was the Apostle Paul talking about many, many years later when he was talking primarily to Timothy and says, listen, all of the Bible is inspired by God. All of it is the very breath of God, and it is useful in the midst of all of life. And so the place we land is, okay, what's up with Leviticus? What is going on in the midst of this book that we can so easily sometimes just simply hurdle over? So I thought this morning for Thanksgiving, we would switch it up a little bit, which could either be good news or bad news, depending on how you're going to take it. But it's an opportunity for us to kind of look into, again, perhaps scriptures that we may often neglect or ignore or wonder why they're there, and begin asking the question, how does this begin to apply to my life here today? If you're just joining us, whether you're with family celebrating Thanksgiving, welcome. It's good to have you here. If you're just kind of getting back into the swing of things, welcome back. But to kind of get you up to speed, we have been journeying through the Old Testament with an understanding of looking at the greater picture of what is going on throughout God's relationship with his people. And we started in Genesis, and we worked our way through Genesis into Exodus. And now this morning, we don't want to ignore what is going on in Leviticus, as hopefully we'll come to a better place of understanding of the way in which it still speaks into all of our lives here today. So if you're with us last week, we left off at the very kind of end of Exodus where God had sent Moses to deliver his people Israel out of slavery in Egypt. You're probably familiar with the story. Pharaoh wasn't so keen on watching his entire workforce leave. So it took 10 significant and severe plagues to get Pharaoh to relent. And then God's people entered into the wilderness heading towards the promised land, whereas you know how the story goes, Pharaoh suddenly realizes, what have I done? My entire workforce has just left. This is not a good idea. And they chase after them towards the Red Sea. And as you keep reading, you see that miraculous miracle, the parting of the Red Sea, and Israel gets to the other side, and they're now safe on the other side. And that's kind of where we land here today, with the question of, okay, so now what? Well, if you read through the historical narrative of the Old Testament, you see that they land at a place called Mount Sinai. And they end up spending about 2 years there. And the whole idea is God is creating this nation. It goes all the way back to Genesis when God made a promise to Abraham, says, I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to bless you so that you will be a blessing to others. And so part of that fulfillment was bringing these people of God out of Egypt and bring them into Canaan so that they can begin to live life with God. And the idea was that these people were to be set apart so that they would begin to mirror what it looked like to have God in their life. So it makes sense that God now needs to spend some time with them, kind of laying out the ground rules. And that's essentially what happens at Mount Sinai. God is saying, listen, if you are my people, then you need to have an understanding as to how I desire that you live. The more well-known part of Mount Sinai is, of course, the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments can be broken down into our relationship with God and then our relationship with others. But you've probably heard messages on the Ten Commandments, and you probably haven't heard a message on Leviticus, so I thought we would go in that direction here this morning. Because Leviticus is the very book that is also given to Moses as he is given the instruction from God to give to the people. Now, clearly, I'm not going to be able to cover everything in Leviticus, but my hope is that we have a better understanding of this book so that it can then begin to become for us another example of just the way in which God encourages us to live all of life with Him. So I thought the most helpful thing for us this morning would be for me to give you some of my observations as I have been reading through and have read through the book of Leviticus on a number of occasions. And then try to tie it all in at the end as to, okay, what does this mean for us? Because I say over and over and over again, the goal of being a follower of Jesus is not simply to accumulate more knowledge, but to become more like Him. To begin to see, how does this play out in my life here today? So the first thing that I observe about Leviticus is essentially how messed up things must have been in that day and age. You may remember that I said last week that the Bible is always written for us, but it wasn't necessarily written specifically to us. And by that I mean that the Bible was written in a time, in a certain place, to a certain culture, understanding a specific context. So when God is telling His people, don't sleep with your relatives, don't sleep with animals, don't offer your children as a sacrifice, what it does is, to us, it screams out the obvious, but to me it begins to lay a foundation as to how messed up things were in which Israel was coming from and was potentially going into. Right before all of these rules are given out in Leviticus 18, and there's a whole laundry list of things that we would take for granted, the very beginning part was what Jill just read, when essentially God says, don't be like the Egyptians, the land from which you just came. Don't be like the Canaanites into the land in which you are going. Essentially, God is saying, listen, you are going to have to decide how your life is going to be influenced, who you are going to follow. And as I begin to think about that, the very same thing is true in our own lives as well. We live in a society, we live in a culture that doesn't necessarily hold up the same things that as a follower of Jesus we may hold up to. So the question we have to ask is, as followers of Jesus, are we being influenced by society? Or, as the book of Leviticus is presenting, are we being an influence positively on the society in which we live, on the things that are clearly taking place? So the first thing I just observe of just what the scenario, what the situation must have looked like. The second thing is how practical God is in giving out his instruction. Again, there's certain things, particularly around the food laws and around skin disease, and we may think, that's just kind of a waste of space. Like, why do we have all of that? But stop and think for a moment that God is taking an entire nation out of Egypt. They are now wandering through the desert. They are now going into an entirely new country and geography and culture. Chances are they're going to come across things they've never seen before, things they may have never considered eating before. And what God begins to do is, I believe, practically lay out for them, there are certain things that are not a good idea. For example, don't eat raw meat. It's just not a good idea. A lot of the animals that are forbidden are often scavengers. And we know that scavengers are those animals that go eat off of other dead animals, oftentimes carrying disease. So then if you eat that animal, likely you're going to inflict yourself with disease as well. And so God is laying out some really practical reasons as to what they shouldn't do to really help them out. We look at the chapter after chapter detail over skin disease. But essentially what God is saying, listen, if you're infected by something that is contagious, don't hang around other people. Get healthy first, and then you can re-engage in the community. So what God is really doing in Leviticus is just really laying out some practical realities, things that would essentially help them in the midst of life. So there's kind of the obvious. There's the practical things, which begin to point me in the reality of, are we going to follow the teachings of God? I'm sure for a lot of the Israelites, they would have read some of those lists and would have thought, I don't understand that. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. God, why are you asking me to do that? Have you ever found yourself in that situation where you wonder perhaps why God has asked you not to do a certain thing or perhaps to do a certain thing? But do you view it in a sense of, this is so restrictive, as opposed to perhaps God having the best intentions at heart? Perspective and trust go a long way. And we see that being taught in the book of Leviticus. But as you keep going through the book of Leviticus, you see that there is an incredible chunk of time and space and pages given over to the importance of worship. Now, at various times and in different conversations, people often say to me, well, wait a second. Why is it that followers of Jesus, why is it that Christians follow some of the laws of the Old Testament, but then not others? Is it just kind of like a buffet? Do you pick and choose? I like that one. That seems palatable, and I'm not going to touch that one over there because that's just kind of weird. And so how does this begin to play out? What's interesting is the book of Leviticus spends an enormous amount of detail focusing on the importance of worship, the importance of animal sacrifice. We're given detail as to how it is to take place, who is to do it. And we can look at that and think, what's going on? But we understand that essentially through the animal sacrifice, we are seeing a relationship restored. We're seeing an aspect of forgiveness taking place. But what I appreciate about the detail that is given is that we need to be intentional. It's not just simply haphazard of, well, you know what, I feel like worshiping God today, so maybe I'll just carve out a little bit of time. The book of Leviticus lays out for us the importance of saying, you know what? God needs to be a priority in your life. You need to spend time. You need to be intentional. But everything in the Old Testament ultimately points us to Jesus. So when Jesus arrives on the scene, all of God's people were waiting in anticipation for the Messiah to come. And we see that in Jesus, as we talked about last week, he was the ultimate Lamb of God. He was the sacrifice who took away all the sins of the world. So now that we have Jesus as our means to restore a relationship with God, it would make absolutely no sense. It would actually be redundant and a slap in the face to continue to follow certain practices of the Old Testament, because we'd basically be saying Jesus is not enough. Or when we come to those places of the food laws, and we know that certain foods were declared unclean, well, Jesus came on the scene and says, eat whatever it is you want. All foods are now clean. So if you're a lover of sushi or of bacon, you can say, thank God for that. We begin to see that absolutely there are certain things in Leviticus, there are certain things in the Old Testament that we no longer follow because of Jesus. And the reality is not that worship has changed. It's not like we suddenly say, well, I'm not going to worship God anymore because we're not going to sacrifice animals, but rather we worship Jesus. We celebrate what he has done in our lives. So the details have changed, but ultimately the principle of Leviticus has not gone away. But then there's a fourth observation, and that is how specific Leviticus is to the importance of taking care of others. You read through the New Testament and you see Jesus often speaking about the importance of loving your neighbor as yourself. Take a wild guess, the only portion in Scripture that is found in. Anyone? Leviticus. There we go. I'm throwing you a softball. It's Thanksgiving. The only place that talks about loving your neighbor as yourself is found in the book of Leviticus. You see, when I break down the book of Leviticus, the three primary teachings that I see is the importance of following God, the importance of worshiping God, the importance of serving others. That's the gospel. That's the reality of what Jesus is teaching us in our own lives as well. And the book of Leviticus is brilliant because it doesn't just simply say, okay, you need to love your neighbor as yourself. You need to serve others. And you think, okay, that is my vision statement. That is what I'm going to do for the rest of my life. God says through Moses in Leviticus, and this is exactly how I want you to do it. Number of places we could go, but there's two primary teachings that show up over and over again in the teachings, and that is the importance of radical generosity. And we see it planted right there in Leviticus. They were taught about the importance of practicing gleaning. And real quickly, what that meant is if you owned a field, when you harvested your field, you would leave the outer portion of your field unharvested, so that people, the disenfranchised of the society, could come into your field after hours, pick the crops, and have something for them. Social justice, other-centered living, right in the fabric of living with God. But then there's a second aspect. It was called the year of Jubilee. And this just blows people's minds because God says every 50 years, every debt is forgiven. Everyone's land is returned to them. And it's mind-blowing because it completely transforms generational poverty. That absolutely, if you make bad decisions and you take on bad debt, you're going to have to pay for that for a period of time, but your children and your children's children won't. And what God's beginning to do is to weave into the fabric not only this radical generosity to help others, but also to root out an incredible cancer. And that is greed. That is greed. You see, capitalism says what's mine is mine. Communism says what's yours should be mine. Jesus says what's mine is yours. It changes everything. And something I just learned this week. Jesus was teaching these principles of other-centeredness while they were wandering in the desert. They had 38 approximately more years until any of them would ever own a single foot of ground. 38 years down the road. Can you imagine being someone sitting there listening, thinking God telling them about the importance of this radical generosity, about the importance of not gleaning your fields, about the importance of the year of Jubilee, of when you own your land and when you take on debt and when you borrow, when you give, make sure you give it back. And you're thinking, I don't have any stuff yet, God. You're still providing us with all the food that we need. I don't got any stuff. And God would probably be like, exactly. Because it is so hard to learn these lessons once you have the stuff. I want it to be a part of the fabric of your life. And that's what we begin to see in the book of Leviticus, is a pointing towards what the gospel is all about. Following Jesus, worshiping Jesus, serving others. Now, absolutely, Leviticus uses some kind of interesting imagery in presenting this. But maybe you want to go back to it with fresh eyes this week. Begin to read through the book of Leviticus and begin to see how these themes begin to present themselves. See how God is essentially setting up his community so that they will live in such a way that it will be completely different to everyone else. That's why God says to Moses, don't be like the Egyptians. Don't be like the Canaanites. Come and follow me. You see, for us to fully appreciate all of the good news of Jesus, we can't just simply leave the Old Testament away. Because the Old Testament sets us up to an even greater understanding of everything that Jesus was giving to us. The Apostle Paul, when speaking to a group of Christians in Rome, used the imagery and the language of Leviticus to hit home with a greater truth. When he says, listen, my brothers and sisters, in view of everything that God has done for you, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. This is what is pleasing to God. This is your act of worship. Don't conform to the ways of the world. Be transformed. If you're a first century Jew hearing those words, you're able to resonate with what's going on. You see, we may not understand and appreciate the sacrificial system in such a way because it is not part of our culture, it is not part of our context. But as we begin to learn more and more and more about the ways in which God was interacting with his people, we see how Leviticus rings true for us here today. Of Jesus simply saying, are you going to follow my way or the ways of the world? Are you going to choose to worship me intentionally and specifically, not with simply what is left over? And will you be other-centered? Will you see what is yours as being available to others? And we begin to see with new eyes just the beauty of the gospel showing up in places we would have never expected. But it is Thanksgiving. So one final thought. A portion of Leviticus is dedicated to celebrations and festivals. It is laid out in great detail as to the importance of celebrating with others, spending times with others. And although there was different festivals at different times and focusing specifically on different details of the relationship with God, the two details that always remain the same were this. You always gave thanks to God. You always looked at what God had given you, and a festival was an opportunity to give thanks to him. But there was a second aspect. And the second aspect was festivals created a bigger opportunity for you to again rededicate your life to following the ways of God. So this Thanksgiving, as you gather together and you celebrate and you give thanks with your family, your friends, it presents a wonderful opportunity for you not only to give thanks for what God has given to you, but for you this Thanksgiving to say, I am rededicating. I am continually going to follow your ways. I'm going to follow your teachings. I'm going to be willing to serve others ahead of myself. It's a wonderful gift of Leviticus. It's a wonderful gift of the Old Testament as it shows us yet again and again and again how everything points us back to Jesus. How everything points us back to truly living all of life with Him. So my hope and my prayer for you this day is that you would celebrate the goodness of God in the midst of all of life. And you would continue to choose this day, as the people in Leviticus did many years ago, to continue to follow God in the midst of all of life. Let us pray together. Lord Jesus, we are just grateful for these